Hi, I'm Grace, interpreter at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum in Little Falls, Minnesota, here to talk to you about Charles Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh. Anne Morrow Lindbergh was born on June 22, 1906, in Englewood, New Jersey, to Dwight Morrow and Elizabeth Betty Cutter. Dwight Morrow worked as a lawyer and eventually went on to work in the banking industry at J.P. Morgan. As a college-educated woman, Anne's mother, Betty, took on many philanthropic adventures. She volunteered and did charitable work at organizations like the YWCA, Community Chest, and Planned Parenthood. As contraceptive devices and birth control became a topic of prominence, Betty Morrow began sponsoring Planned Parenthood meetings in her home. Anne Morrow attended prestigious schools where she accelerated in theater, writing, and academics. When it was time for Anne to attend college, she was expected to choose her mother's alma mater, Smith College. Anne wanted to go to Vassar instead of Smith, desiring to go to a school where she wouldn't be compared to her mother or her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth Reeve Morrow was the firstborn of Dwight and Betty. She inherited her father's wit and charm and instantly had favor with her parents. Described as a vivacious blonde who was academically and socially successful, she personified what her mother wanted. Elizabeth was plagued with rheumatic fever that would cause heart complications until her death in 1934. Anne always compared herself to her older sister, quote, "such a goose next to a swan," and sought to prove her own uniqueness and individuality, despite believing she was the most self-conscious adolescent that has ever lived. Although Anne wished to attend Vassar, her attempts for autonomy fell flat. Anne attended Smith College, where she majored in English literature and studied creative writing. Anne eventually graduated with honors. Anne's father, Dwight Morrow, became the United States ambassador to Mexico in 1927. Ambassador Morrow asked Charles to make a goodwill flight to Mexico City to help relationships between Mexico and the United States. The Morrow family would join Charles during the flight. Just 5 days before her first flight, Anne wrote that she dreaded meeting Charles. She said, quote, "all this public hero stuff breaking into our family party, how could Lindy, the baseballer type, not at all intellectual and not of my world, at all possibly fit in with my scholarly family?" Anne admitted her perceptions about the young pilot were wrong. On their first date, Charles took her flying. In her diary, Anne wrote, "Suddenly I felt the real sensation of going up, a great lift, like a bird, like one's dreams of flying. We soared in layers. The lift that took your breath away, there it was again. I will not be happy till it happens again." Anne would see Charles at a Christmas party in 1927, where she made small talk with the young aviator. Charles was impressed by Anne's quiet demeanor, though Charles believed that Anne stood in the shadow of her older sister Elizabeth. Charles wrote, "She stood in the shadow thrown by the sparkling vivacity of her older sister." There has been speculation and arguments between journalists and historians about the depth of the relationship between Elizabeth and Charles. There is documented evidence that Charles visited Elizabeth at Englewood when her father was ill. Anne wrote that she was certain he had stopped by solely to see her sister, and she lamented that he would get on with Elizabeth and avoid me. After 2 dates, Charles proposed to Anne. Just 3 months after their wedding, Anne made her first solo flight. In the 1930s, Anne was the first woman in the United States to earn her glider's license. In 1934, Anne was awarded the National Geographic's Hubbard Medal for flights totaling 40,000 miles and in recognition of her role in navigation, radio operating, and piloting. She was the 10th person to receive the award and the first woman. The Hubbard Medal she received displayed the flight route she had made with her husband the year before. In all her achievements, in 1932, a dark cloud casted over Anne as her infant son, Charles Jr., was kidnapped and murdered by Bruno Richard Hauptmann. For days, Anne relived every moment with her child. Grief consumed her as she watched the media invade every aspect of their lives. Anne had suffered immense personal tragedy, losing her father in 1931, her son in 1932, and her sister Elizabeth in 1934. The sensational trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a photograph of their son's body released to the press, and threats exhausted the Lindberghs. Desperate to escape the national attention, Charles and Anne sought refuge in England. England had become a haven for the Lindberghs. Anne began writing a new book, an account of their 1933 journey from Africa to America, titled "Listen to the Wind." It was published in 1938 and became an instant bestseller. It was among the 10 best-selling nonfiction books in the United States for 2 years in a row. It received the National Book Award for Nonfiction. During World War II, Anne and Charles became figures of public controversy. Charles was enlisted to tour German plane factories on behalf of the United States to check on the condition of German aviation. Both Anne and Charles had become enamored of Germany's technological advances and displays of nationalism. Charles accepted the Service Cross of the German Eagle from the Nazi regime and became a vocal opponent of the US entering World War II. Anne wrote a book titled A Wave of the Future, a confession in faith that favored isolationism and described fascism as the wave of the future. Anne also wrote A Prayer for Peace, which was published in a January 1940 edition of Reader's Digest. Writing before the fall of France and the Battle of Britain, she called for a negotiated peace based on mutual interests and mutual advantages. Anne and Charles became a pariah in the United States. It is speculated that Anne's own mother, who was a strong interventionist, would not talk to the couple. In her later writings, Anne regretted her admiration for Germany, stating, quote, "My marriage has stretched me out of my world, changed me so it is no longer possible to change back." After Pearl Harbor, Charles went to the South Pacific, where he aided the United States military, and Anne found solace in writing. In 1955, she released Gift from the Sea, a reflection of women's lives. The book was dubbed a feminist manifesto and became a finalist for the National Book Award. It topped the bestseller list for 80 weeks. The book was a personal experience of living with a man who was controlling, sometimes cruel, and was later found to have 3 secret families in Europe. All of these experiences, being the aviator's wife, undoubtedly bled into her writing. Anne continued to write and publish works such as The Steep Ascent in 1944, The Unicorn and Other Poems in 1956, and Dearly Beloved in 1962. Anne also published her personal diaries ranging from 1936 to 1986. In the late 1960s, Anne turned her energy towards a new cause, the environment. In 1966, Anne's essays titled Earthshine was published, consisting of 2 long essays that had previously been featured in Life magazine and her 1970 commencement address to Smith College, where Anne was awarded her honorary doctorate. Anne wrote that the environmental crisis was encroaching on us like a lava flow. She urged her audiences to seek solutions to the inevitable degradation that could affect the world around them. Reversing the trends, Anne stated, will take a revolution. In 1966, Anne was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame, and in 1979, Anne was inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame along with Neil Armstrong. After her husband's death in 1974, Anne continued writing from her secluded home in Connecticut. In the early 1990s, a series of strokes left Anne permanently disabled and suffered from memory issues. In 2001, Anne died peacefully in her home at the age of 94. Anne passed on her writing talents to her children. Reeve and Anne Spencer went on to become award-winning authors. Anne's son inherited her adventurous spirit and became a renowned diver. Her 2 other sons, Landon Scott, live life out of the spotlight in Montana and Brazil, rarely making public appearances or talking about their families. Anne Morrow Lindbergh's legacy is often overshadowed by Charles's accomplishments and controversies. Perhaps the best way to convey the impact of Anne is to quote her daughter, Reeve. Reeve told the New York Times that, "Some people think that my mother, all 90 pounds of her, is a fragile woman. She's about as fragile as a bar of steel." During a period when women faced immeasurable obstacles, Anne chose to model her life along fundamental new lines, showing courage and extraordinary skill. She can hardly be simply called Charles Lindbergh's wife, but a trailblazer for women.
Special thanks to the Laura Jane Musser Fund for making this and other educational videos possible. If you enjoyed this presentation, please come visit us at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum.